They arrested her only to face her again in court, as the judge deciding their fate. It was a crisp autumn afternoon in Asheville, North Carolina. The park was a sanctuary of life. Children's laughter rang through the air. Couples strolled hand in hand, and the golden leaves of towering maples fluttered in the gentle breeze. Near the pond, on a weathered wooden bench, sat Madeline Carter, a woman in her mid-30s, her keen brown eyes scanning the pages of a thick legal textbook. A highly respected attorney with an unshakable reputation, this rare moment of quiet was a luxury in her demanding schedule. She was lost in her reading when the abrupt screech of tires shattered the tranquility. Heads turned as a police cruiser rolled to an abrupt stop by the curb. Two officers stepped out, Officer Grayson and Officer Mitchell, their postures rigid, exuding an air of authority. They swept their gazes over the park, then zeroed in on Madeline, the only person sitting alone. Their expressions hardened. She looked up, confusion flickering across her face, as they strode toward her. What happened next would change all of their lives forever. "Ma'am, mind if we have a word?" The voice was firm, authoritative, not a request, but a demand wrapped in polite phrasing. Madeline looked up from her book, her expression unreadable, calm. "Of course," she said, closing the hardcover with deliberate care. The second officer, Mitchell, stepped closer, his stance rigid. "We received a call about some suspicious activity in the area. Would you mind telling us what you're doing here?" Madeline tilted her head slightly, her brow furrowing. Suspicious activity. She glanced around, as if searching for something, anything that might justify their presence. "I'm just sitting here, reading." She lifted the book slightly, the title visible beneath her fingers, but their expressions remained unchanged and yielding. "Can we see some ID?" Officer Grayson asked, his voice edged with something that wasn't quite aggression, but carried the weight of expectation. A flicker of tension passed through her, though her posture never faltered. "I'm not sure I understand," she said smoothly. "What's the reason for this?" "It's routine," Mitchell responded, but the way he said it made it clear this was anything but. A quiet murmur spread through the small crowd that had gathered nearby. Some onlookers watched with mild curiosity, while others exchanged uneasy glances, sensing the lopsided nature of the exchange. Madeline exhaled softly, resisting the urge to roll her eyes. She reached into her bag, pulled out her wallet, and handed over her driver's license. Officer Grayson took it, holding it longer than necessary, his gaze dragging over the details as if he expected to find something incriminating. "Madeline Carter," he read aloud, his tone teetering between mockery and suspicion. "What brings you out here today, Miss Carter?" She met his eyes, her voice even, steady. "I live here. I came to enjoy the park. Is that a problem?" His jaw flexed. "We'll see," he muttered, handing back her ID, but neither officer moved to leave. Instead, they lingered, their questions shifting from procedural to something else entirely. "You always carry a book like that around?" Officer Mitchell sneered, eyes flicking to the hardcover still clutched in her hands. "Are you out here alone, or waiting for someone?" Grayson added, his fingers resting on his belt just close enough to his holster to send an unmistakable message. The unease in the air thickened. Madeline felt the weight of their scrutiny, of the crowd's hushed whispers, of the unspoken challenge hanging between them, and she knew this was no routine stop. Madeline had navigated countless high-stakes confrontations in courtrooms, standing firm against prosecutors, hostile witnesses, and even judges. But this was different. The power imbalance was blatant, the undercurrent in their voices all too familiar. She knew the game they were playing. Still, she measured her words, refusing to let them bait her. "I'm not answering any more questions unless you tell me what I'm being accused of," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. A flicker of irritation crossed Officer Grayson's face. "Don't get smart with us," he snapped, stepping closer. "We're just doing our job, and I know the law," Madeline countered, holding his gaze. Sitting in a public park isn't a crime, but logic wasn't what they were after. Grayson's hand shot out, fingers clamping around her arm. "You're resisting," he declared flatly. She hadn't moved, hadn't even flinched. "What are you doing?" Madeline's voice sharpened, shock flashing across her face. The crowd stirred, their murmurs swelling. A man near the front pulled out his phone, raising it to record. The moment was shifting. The air crackled with an unspoken challenge, and Madeline knew this wasn't just about her anymore. "Stop resisting." The words were barked louder this time, a performance for the crowd as much as a command. Madeline's pulse pounded in her ears as she felt the cold bite of metal snap around her wrists. The humiliation burned hot, suffocating, but she forced herself to stay calm. Losing control wouldn't help her now. The officers led her toward the cruiser, ignoring the murmurs, the questions, the outrage flickering through the gathered onlookers. As they reached the car, Madeline turned her head, her eyes locked onto a young woman holding up her phone, recording everything. A silent exchange passed between them. "Don't stop recording." The car door slammed shut, sealing her in. But even as the world outside blurred past, Madeline knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was only the beginning. The back seat of the cruiser felt smaller than it should have, the air thick with an unspoken charge. Madeline stared out the window, her reflection a fractured blur against the city lights. The irony wasn't lost on her. She had spent years fighting for justice, defending clients, challenging abuses of power. And now, she was on the other side of it. The absurdity of it all pressed against her chest, but there was no humor in it, only anger. The ride to the station was silent, save for the sporadic crackle of the police radio. The cuffs bit into her skin, her wrists aching. At the station, things only got worse. The booking process was designed for one thing: to strip a person of their dignity. Fingerprinting mugshots, a cold impersonal voice listing off charges that made her stomach turn. Then the final insult, a holding cell, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, their sterile hum drilling into her skull. Madeline sat on the hard bench, exhaling slowly. They thought this was over. They had no idea what was coming next. "Enjoy your stay." The words dripped with smugness as Officer Grayson slammed the cell door shut. Madeline sat stiffly on the cold bench, her hands clasped in her lap, fingers pressing against each other in an effort to stay grounded. Her mind replayed the events at the park, each moment folding in on itself like a cruel loop. How had a quiet afternoon unraveled into this? The answer was as bitter as it was obvious: prejudice. Hours dragged by before anyone even acknowledged her existence. Finally, a young officer approached the cell, a clipboard in hand. His expression was unreadable, detached. "Miss Carter, you've been charged with resisting arrest and obstructing a peace officer," he stated flatly. Madeline's jaw tightened. "On what grounds?" she demanded, her voice sharper than intended. The officer barely blinked. "You can discuss that in court." Then, just like that, he turned and walked away. She inhaled deeply, forcing herself to think, not react. The charges were flimsy. They had no real case, but she also knew that wouldn't matter. Cases like hers rarely played out in the arena of truth. They were battles, and she was about to fight one. When she was finally released on bail, the crisp night air hit her like a shockwave, a stark contrast to the suffocating sterility of the station. She barely had time to process it before she heard a familiar voice. "Madeline." She turned just as Marissa Langley, her longtime friend and colleague, rushed toward her. Relief and worry battled for control in Marissa's expression. "Are you okay?" she asked, scanning Madeline as if checking for injuries. Madeline nodded, but the slight tremor in her hands betrayed her. "I'm fine." It wasn't true, and they both knew it. The drive was quiet at first, the city lights streaking past in a blur. Every so often, Marissa glanced at her, waiting. Finally, Madeline spoke, her voice steady. "I'm not letting this slide, Marissa, not this time." Marissa's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "What are you thinking?" Madeline looked out the window, her reflection staring back at her. "They wanted a fight," she murmured. "They just got one." "I'm thinking I'm tired of this happening," Madeline said, her voice unwavering. "I have the tools, the knowledge, and the resources to fight back, and I will." That night, Madeline sat at her kitchen table, the dim glow of a desk lamp, casting long shadows over stacks of legal pads and open law books. She worked relentlessly, outlining a civil rights lawsuit against the officers and the department. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with an unshakable determination. As the days stretched into weeks, the case took on a life of its own. The video of her arrest recorded by the young woman in the park had gone viral. It spread across social media like wildfire. News outlets picked it up. The footage of Madeline, composed yet unyielding as the officers restrained her, became a symbol of something much bigger than herself. Messages flooded in from strangers, from people who had endured similar injustices, from allies who refused to stay silent. Every email, every phone call, every comment only strengthened her resolve. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was for every person who had been silenced, humiliated, or dismissed. But as she built her case, she encountered resistance from an unexpected place, her own law firm. At first they were hesitant, worried. They saw the media firestorm brewing around her name. They whispered about reputation, risk, and consequences. But Madeline didn't waver. She stood before them calm, but unyielding. "This isn't just about me," she told them. "This is about setting a precedent. If we don't fight this, who will?" The room fell silent, because deep down, they knew she was right. The viral video did more than spread her story. It sparked a movement. It ignited conversations across the city and beyond. And as the image of Madeline Carter standing her ground as officers forced her away circulated across screens, one thing became clear. Justice was coming. And no one, not the officers, not the department, not even the system itself, was prepared for what would happen next. Reporters called. Emails poured in. The story was everywhere, but Madeline refused every interview request. She wasn't in this for media attention. Her focus was singular. Building a case that wouldn't just hold the officers accountable but expose the systemic failures that allowed this to keep happening. But at night, when the world went quiet, the weight of it all settled on her shoulders. She replayed the arrest in her mind, the cold detachment in their voices, the bite of the cuffs, the murmurs from the crowd. How easily could it have escalated further? The thought churned in her stomach, sending a sharp wave of unease through her, but instead of fear, it fueled her. One evening, as she pored over legal documents, Marissa showed up with takeout. She barely looked up when the scent of warm food filled the room. Marissa set the bags on the table and crossed her arms. "You've been at this for hours. I don't have a choice." Madeline's response came without hesitation, her eyes still scanning her laptop screen. Marissa sighed, sliding into the chair across from her. She studied her friend, the exhaustion buried beneath her sharp focus. "You know this is bigger than just a legal battle, right? People are looking to you now." That made Madeline pause. Slowly, she closed her laptop and met Marissa's gaze. "I know," she said quietly. Then, with steel in her voice, she added, "That's why I can't afford to lose." Her preparation was meticulous. She combed through case law, dissected precedents, and pieced together a legal strategy designed to dismantle every false claim against her. She wasn't just fighting back. She was building a case that would shake the system. And when she stepped into that courtroom, they would know exactly who they were up against. Madeline knew she couldn't fight this battle alone. She assembled a team of trusted colleagues who shared her passion for justice. Sharp minds, unwavering resolve. People who understood that this case wasn't just about her arrest. It was about something much bigger. But the fight wasn't confined to the courtroom. She immersed herself in the community, attending town halls, listening to those who had lived through similar injustices, speaking at colleges about accountability and systemic reform. This wasn't just a legal case anymore, it was a movement. One afternoon, after a long meeting, Madeline was walking toward her car when she heard a hesitant voice behind her. "Miss Carter." She turned to see a woman standing there, early 40s, eyes filled with something raw and unspoken. "Yes," the woman exhaled, as if working up the courage to speak. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said, her voice breaking. "For standing up to them. For standing up for all of us." Madeline felt her throat tighten. She managed a small smile. "I'm just doing what I can." The woman nodded, her eyes shining with something between gratitude and relief. Then, just as quickly, she turned and walked away. Madeline stood there for a long moment, her chest tightening. The community's support was a double-edged sword. It gave her strength, but it also heightened the pressure. She couldn't let them down. Then, one day, her attorney called. "Madeline, you're going to want to hear this. The officers you're suing have filed a motion to dismiss the case." Madeline barely reacted. She had expected this, a standard legal maneuver: stall, delay, deflect. But then, her attorney hesitated. "Madeline, there's something else you should know." She sat up, sensing the shift in his tone. "You've been assigned as the judge for one of their cases next month." The words hit like a punch to the gut. For weeks, she had been preparing to face these officers in court as a plaintiff, and now fate had flipped the script. Madeline leaned back in her chair, absorbing the revelation. The irony was staggering. Could she do this? Could she sit on that bench and remain impartial? For a fleeting second, doubt crept in. But then she thought about everything they had put her through. She thought about the handcuffs, the humiliation, the silent exchange with the woman in the crowd, the countless others who had suffered the same injustice. This wasn't a coincidence. This was an opportunity to show the world what real justice looked like. The courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs as people filtered in, filling the gallery with an undercurrent of anticipation. Madeline sat behind the bench, her expression unreadable, her posture steady. The case itself wasn't hyperviolent, internal misconduct hearing. 2 officers accused of excessive force in an unrelated incident. But the weight of it, the symbolism, was impossible to ignore, and when the officers walked in, their eyes finally meeting hers, the realization dawned across their faces. They knew, and for the first time they were the ones who looked afraid. To most it was just another day in the justice system. The 2 officers, Grayson and Mitchell, sat at the defense table, their uniforms still crisp, still carrying the weight of authority. They leaned toward each other, speaking in low tones, their expressions unbothered, almost bored. To them, this was routine. Another hurdle to clear. Another case to dismiss and forget. Then, the door to the judge's chambers opened, and the room fell into an eerie silence. Madeline Carter stepped onto the bench, the flow of her black robe trailing behind her like a shadow. Her movements were measured, precise, unshaken. She took her seat, her expression unreadable, calm yet commanding. Then, her eyes flicked toward the defendants, and in an instant, everything changed. Officer Grayson's face drained of color. His hands curled into fists against the table. Mitchell shifted uncomfortably, his jaw clenching as realization hit him like a freight train. It was her, the woman they had humiliated, the woman they had thrown in handcuffs. Now she was the one holding their fate in her hands. Madeline let the moment stretch, let them feel the weight of it. Then, in a clear, unwavering voice, she began the proceedings. This court is now in session. Please be seated. The officers lowered into their chairs stiffly, their confidence fracturing at the edges. For the first time, they understood what it meant to be powerless in a system they thought they controlled. And Madeline Carter was just getting started. Carter leaned in, whispering something to their attorney. The lawyer gave a slight nod but kept his gaze fixed on Judge Madeline Carter. For the first time in weeks, Madeline felt the shift, the upper hand tilting in her favor. But this wasn't about revenge. She had sworn an oath to uphold the law impartially, and she would. Still, the irony of the moment wasn't lost on her, or anyone else in the room. As the attorneys delivered their opening arguments, Madeline remained professional. She listened carefully, taking deliberate notes, ensuring that every point was considered with precision. But every so often her gaze flickered toward the officers. She saw the tightness in their shoulders, the way their fingers twitched, the restless energy of men who had once controlled the game, now forced to play by the rules. During recess, Carter and Mitchell stepped into the hallway, their voices sharp and low. "How is she?" Carter hissed, frustration bleeding into every syllable. "This has to be a setup," Mitchell muttered, shaking his head. Their attorney exhaled, rubbing his temple. "It's not a setup. It's a coincidence, and you need to stay focused." His tone hardened. "She's not the enemy here. Your actions are." But they weren't listening. They were too consumed by the surreal nature of their predicament. When court resumed, Madeline remained composed, ensuring that the hearing proceeded fairly and efficiently. She gave them no reason to claim bias, no reason to doubt her professionalism, and yet her mere presence alone was enough to unsettle them completely. They had walked into this courtroom expecting another routine hearing. Instead, they found themselves facing the one person they never thought they'd answer to. And for the first time, they were the ones on trial. Every time she addressed them, they shifted in their seats, their confidence unraveling, inch by inch. At one point, during witness testimony, Madeline caught Carter sneaking a glance at her. It wasn't the cocky defiance she had expected. It was something else, something closer to regret. As if, for the first time, he was beginning to grasp the weight of what they had done. By the end of the day, the tension in the courtroom was suffocating. When Madeline adjourned the hearing, her gavel struck with finality, a sharp, deliberate sound that echoed through the silent room. "We will reconvene tomorrow at 9 a.m., she announced. People rose from their seats, murmuring as they filed out. The officers stood as well, but they didn't move toward the door right away. Madeline could feel their stares lingering. Hesitation, indecision. She didn't look up, continuing to organize her notes, as if their presence was inconsequential. For a moment, it seemed like they were debating whether to approach her, but in the end, they didn't. They turned and left, their steps heavier than before, their silence louder than any words they could have spoken. But for Madeline, this case wasn't about irony. It was about the decisions that would follow, and whether justice could truly prevail. The next morning, the courtroom was packed. People knew what was coming. They could feel it, and so could she. The real fight was just beginning. News of the unexpected twist had spread fast. By the time the hearing resumed, the courtroom was packed, a larger crowd than usual for a misconduct case. Some had come out of curiosity, drawn by the irony of the moment. Others were there to support Madeline, even though they knew her role, as the judge, meant she couldn't afford to show favoritism. Madeline entered the courtroom with the same calm, collected demeanor, her black robe flowing behind her as she ascended to the bench. She didn't acknowledge the weight of the eyes on her, didn't flinch at the hushed whispers that rippled through the gallery. Instead, she focused on what mattered. Justice. The attorneys wasted no time. The prosecutor began, methodically laying out the case. He presented evidence, witness testimony, and finally, the words that made the air in the room go still. Your Honor, the officers' actions were not just a lapse in judgment, they were a blatant abuse of power. Their behavior reflects a pattern of disregard for the very people they are sworn to protect. Madeline's face remained unreadable. Her pen moved across her notepad, deliberate, steady. She listened to every word, her focus unshakable, and yet she could feel it, the officers shifting uncomfortably under her gaze. Then, the defense attorney stood, adjusting his tie as he spoke. His tone was measured, but strained. Your Honor, while we acknowledge the incident in question, we argue that the situation escalated due to factors beyond the officers' control. Their intent was not malicious, and we believe this case lacks sufficient grounds for punitive measures. Madeline leaned back slightly, fingers resting against the wood of the bench. She had heard these arguments before, not here, not in this case, but in her own, and as the debate continued, as lawyers dissected policy, intent, and authorities, she couldn't ignore the parallels between this case and her own experience, because she knew firsthand what it felt like to be on the other side of that power. And now, the question wasn't just whether these officers would face consequences, it was whether the system would allow it. The excuses, the justifications. Madeline had heard them before. Too many times. Yet, she forced herself to push aside her personal feelings, determined to let the facts, not emotion, lead her. When it was time for witness cross-examinations, the tension in the room thickened. The prosecutor called the victim to the stand, a young man named Ethan. He looked uneasy as he settled into the chair, his fingers gripping the edge of the witness stand. His voice trembled at first, but his words carried undeniable weight. They didn't even give me a chance to explain, Ethan said, his eyes flicking between the attorneys and the officers. It felt like they decided I was guilty before I even opened my mouth. The prosecutor pressed further. And did you resist their orders at any point? No. Ethan's voice was steady now, his conviction growing. I was scared, but I did everything they said. It didn't matter, they had already made up their minds. The room was silent. Even the hum of the courtroom lights seemed distant. Then, the defense attorney rose, his expression carefully neutral. He tried to poke holes in Ethan's testimony, questioning his memory, subtly implying he might have misinterpreted the officer's actions. But Ethan held his ground. His voice didn't waver. His story didn't change. From the bench, Madeline watched intently, her expression unreadable. And then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The defendants were called to testify. Officer Carter was the first. As he approached the stand, his eyes flicked toward Madeline. A flicker of something crossed his face, recognition, regret, fear. He raised his hand and swore the oath, but when he opened his mouth to speak, his voice wasn't as steady as before. The power dynamics had shifted, and for the first time he knew it. Officer Carter, the prosecutor began, his voice steady, calculated. You've been accused of using excessive force in this incident. Can you explain your actions that night? Carter hesitated. For the first time, his confidence wavered. His eyes flicked toward Mitchell, as if searching for reassurance, before finally answering, I thought the situation was escalating. I made a judgment call. The prosecutor didn't blink. And do you believe your actions were justified? Carter shifted in his seat, his shoulders tensed, his fingers curled slightly against the witness stand. At the time, yes, his voice was quieter now, but looking back, I could have handled it differently. A beat of silence, the prosecutor pressed. Handled it differently how? Carter exhaled, the weight of the room pressing in on him. By not tackling an unarmed, compliant individual to the ground. The admission lingered in the air, heavy with finality. As the hearing wore on, the cracks in the officer's defense widened. The evidence was overwhelming. The testimonies painted a clear picture, and when the prosecutor rose for his closing argument, he didn't hold back. This case is not just about one night. It's about accountability. It's about making it clear that those who wear a badge are not above the law. If we do nothing today, we send a message that abuse of power is acceptable. But if we take action, we set a precedent. We say, unequivocally, that this will not be tolerated. His words echoed through the courtroom. Then came the defense's closing statement, and it was clear they were grasping at straws. Their arguments felt hollow, their justifications weak. Even the officers themselves seemed to know it. Because no matter how they tried to spin it, the truth was already out in the open, and Madeline Carter was about to deliver the final word. The defense's arguments lacked conviction. Even the officers seemed resigned to the inevitable. Madeline adjourned the hearing, her voice steady as she announced, "A ruling will be delivered tomorrow." The next morning, the courtroom was packed. Reporters lined the back wall, their notebooks open, cameras poised ready to capture every word. This wasn't just about two officers anymore. It had become a symbol, a case that represented something much bigger: fight for justice, for accountability, for change. When Madeline spoke, her voice was calm but firm. The role of law enforcement is to protect and serve the community with integrity, respect, and fairness. When those entrusted with this responsibility abuse their power, it erodes public trust and causes harm far beyond the immediate victim. She paused, letting the weight of those words settle over the room. Then, she delivered her ruling. Carter and Mitchell were found guilty of misconduct. Their punishment was clear: unpaid suspensions, mandatory retraining in de-escalation and ethics, a formal disciplinary record that would follow them throughout their careers. It was firm but fair, a balance between accountability and the opportunity for reform. When she finished, Madeline brought the gavel down with finality. "This court is adjourned." The officers stood, their faces somber, their postures stiff. As they prepared to leave, Carter hesitated. For a moment, it looked like he might just walk out. But then, slowly, he turned back toward Madeline. His voice was barely above a whisper. "Your Honor, I'm sorry, it wasn't enough, but it was something." Later that evening, Madeline sat in a crowded community meeting hall. Residents gathered, sharing their frustrations, their hopes, their stories. As she listened, she felt at the undeniable pulse of something greater than just one case. A movement, a shift in the tide, and in that moment, she knew, her fight was far from over. After the meeting, an older woman approached Madeline, her hands trembling as she reached for hers. Her eyes shone with unspoken emotions: relief, gratitude, something deeper. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "What you did in that courtroom, it means the world to us." Madeline squeezed her hand gently. She smiled, but not with finality, not with satisfaction, because she knew this wasn't the end. "This is just the beginning," she said. "There's so much more work to do." In the days that followed, conversations that once felt impossible began to take shape. Community leaders, law enforcement, local activists, they came together not in perfect agreement, not without struggle, but with a willingness to talk, to listen, to push for something better. Change, though slow as possible. One afternoon, Madeline stood on the steps of the courthouse, the autumn sun casting long shadows across the pavement. Ahead of her, a group of young activists gathered for a peaceful rally, holding signs, speaking with urgency, carrying the fight forward. She watched them, feeling something stir in her chest. Not relief, not closure, hope. The system wasn't perfect, far from it. But with enough voices, enough persistence, enough relentless demand for justice, it could be pushed toward progress. And that, she thought, is the kind of justice worth fighting for. If you believe in the power of accountability and change, subscribe to our channel for more stories that inspire action and reflection, because justice doesn't happen on its own. It happens when we demand it. Together.